If you've watched the medieval church video that I've put up, then you'll be aware of the many challenges facing the church during the Middle Ages and the three responses that the church had towards the corruption and the fears of the time: monasticism, radicalism, and reform from within. And in this video we're going to look at a key event in church history that began, I think, as reform from within. It's certainly intended as reform from within, but escalated to end up in the most radical event of all, the great schism that we know as the Reformation. And the key man behind all this is Martin Luther, a name who I'm sure is familiar to all of you. Martin Luther was born in 1483 into a prosperous middle-class family. His father, who by all accounts was quite an overbearing man, was very keen that he studied the law, which Luther duly did. And many people have seen Luther's relationship with his father as key to his later theology, and somebody who struggled with his father's will for his life. And so in his rebellion against the father, some people have also seen his rebellion against the Catholic Church and the overbearing dominance of that organisation. Who knows, if you go down that particular rabbit hole, you can end up anywhere. In 1505, Luther was on a journey and he was very nearly struck by a bolt of lightning. And in his terror, he cried out that if God would spare him, he would become a monk. And Luther was somebody who never did anything by half. So he not only became a monk, he entered an Augustinian priory, one of the absolute strictest. Luther, like many of his age, was deeply concerned with questions of judgment and salvation. How could he know that he was saved? How could he avoid the pains of hell? And perhaps more than most, these fears seemed to have become something of a neurosis with him. They played very heavily on his mind. They became an obsession. However hard he tried to please God, he just could not be sure that he was doing enough. In 1508, while still a monk, he took up a lectureship in Wittenberg in eastern Germany, what we now call Germany. It was then part of the Holy Roman Empire and Saxony. Wittenberg was a new university which had little prestige. It wasn't like the universities in Oxford or Cambridge or Paris. It was not the sort of place from where you could imagine earth-shattering events happening. But it was whilst he was studying and teaching at Wittenberg that Luther re-engaged with Paul's letters to the Romans and St. Augustine. Remember, he was an Augustinian monk. And so he began to reject the heavily Aristotelian basis for much of the theology of his time. In particular, he rediscovered justification by faith, the scriptural and Augustinian view that none of our good works can ever by themselves make us right with God, that it is by God's grace alone that we are saved, and that the promises of salvation are claimed by us through faith and not works. And this reputedly took place during a period of intense study in a tower in Wittenberg. There are plenty of legends about Luther. But one of the things we do know is that he really struggled with his bowels. He struggled with constipation quite a lot, and for that reason spent quite a lot of time on the toilet. And it was supposedly during one of these sessions that he had something of a eureka moment. I'll leave that to your imagination. Most of Luther's Wittenberg is now changed. There's not much left, but you can still find the toilet. Whether it's become a place of pilgrimage, I'm not sure, and quite what Luther would have made of that, I don't know. Anyway, whether he was on the toilet or not, justification by faith was something that came to him and he took very, very dearly. The common view of the time was that God justifies all those who with faith and humility are able to receive his promise. However, faith and humility were seen as human efforts and not the result of divine grace. Human beings, through their own willpower, needed to demonstrate faith and humility. And if they did so, they would be saved. If you think back to some of the things we've looked on about Augustine and Pelagius, you'll see some of those themes emerging again. But for Luther, he couldn't see how human faith and humility could ever be strong enough to meet God's demands. Justification was an impossible promise held out to us. We couldn't be good enough. Luther saw that righteousness is not something that God demands of us in order to be right with him. Righteousness is something that God himself provides through the death of his Son. Luther changes our status even though our nature remains sinful. In Luther's famous phrase, man is simultaneously a sinner and justified. This therefore began to raise all sorts of questions in Luther's mind about the need for the mediation of Mary and the saints, the purpose of penance, and the role of the church, the pope, and sacraments. But all of these thoughts may simply have been academic inquiries had it not been for the sale of indulgences that sparked Luther's anger. Indulgences grew out of the doctrine of purgatory that developed in the Western, although not the Eastern Church, during the Middle Ages. Purgatory was a pathway to heaven, the basic principle being that when you died, you needed to have the various sins that you had accumulated over the course of your life purged away. The purging could be shortened through the prayers of the faithful still on earth, and the wealthy left money for masses to be said to them after their death, some of them going even as far as to build little chapels like the one here in St James Norton, chantries as they are called, for their services. But what about those who couldn't afford to pay for a chantry or a priest? Well, the theory went that the Pope had at his command the infinite merits of Jesus along with Mary and all the saints. It was as though the Pope had the keys to a treasury of forgiveness that he could dispense. And these could be dished out to shorten the journey of souls in purgatory. Now, it's important to stress that it wasn't intended that Christians pay for forgiveness, nothing quite that transactional. It was expected that the grateful Christian would give something back to the church as thanks for the forgiveness of Jesus. And if any of you have ever heard a giving sermon, particularly one of mine, you'll know that giving sermons frequently stress the importance of response. We respond to God's grace by giving ourselves back financially and otherwise. Well, of course, over time, the forgiveness and the payment became conflated into one act. And it became a vital source of fundraising for the church. And it became particularly important in 1517 when Pope Leo X decided to raise funds for the building of St. Peter's Basilica. And the German Archbishop was going to get a cut out of this. A flamboyant Dominican monk called Johann Tetzel, who was effectively the sales manager for the Pope, was appointed to go and collect money for those who wanted to release loved ones from purgatory. And no emotional blackmail was too low to get the money in. He even had a little ditty which went something like, "As soon as the penny in the coffer rings, the soul from out of purgatory springs." It might have been set to a tune, I don't know. Luther was furious about this, not just because it's theologically wrong, but because he saw the exploitation of the German poor by the Italian rich. And he reacted by pinning a notice of 95 theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, protesting against the sale of indulgences. Actually, he may not have done that, like most things in Luther's life. There's a little bit of debate as to whether that's legend or not. But it's a good legend. You can imagine Luther nailing his indulgences to the church or the castle's door. And this was actually a normal way of prompting a public debate, almost like shoving something up on Facebook or Twitter. Had the notice been ignored, then probably it would have fizzled out, because there would have been other people protesting against indulgences. They were hardly popular things, and Wittenberg was an almost irrelevant town far from the centres of power. The problem was that Luther's theological protest about grace and salvation was seen by the church as a political protest about authority at a time when the church was feeling quite vulnerable on this. And so the church kicked back at Luther, and the more the church kicked back, the more Luther took on the role of a rebel. His refusal to recant his views on grace called into question his views on papal authority, and in 1520 his teaching was condemned. When the bull of condemnation was delivered to him in Wittenberg, he publicly burnt it in front of a cheering crowd. There's not really any way back from that, and with nothing left to lose, Luther now rolled out his full theology of grace, salvation and the church, which he had spent his last 5 years thinking through. I think even at this stage, he still hoped that the Pope would sit up and take notice and that the church would be changed from within. But it wasn't going to happen like that. He published 3 key works: the Appeal to the Nobility of the German Nation, which was his manifesto of reform; the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which was his view on the sacraments; the Freedom of a Christian, his view on justification. These words set down a theology radically at odds with Rome. He argued for a priesthood of all believers, the ability of clergy to marry, the requirement for scripture to be in the vernacular, and for every believer to have a right to read and interpret scripture. He argued for the priority of secular Christian leaders over the Pope, the right of the laity to receive bread and wine at Mass, and he denied the doctrine of transubstantiation. So why wasn't Luther burned at the stake as had happened to Jan Hus and countless other reformers over the past 100 years? Well, there was a young emperor on the throne, Charles V. He didn't want a civil war. He was a serious-minded Christian who wanted to actually hear Luther's opinions in the hope that Luther would recant. So rather than move against Luther, he asked Luther to attend a German parliament called a Diet at Worms in 1521, where Luther was asked to explain his views and asked to recant. Luther gave a lengthy speech explaining why he couldn't do this, which was later boiled down to his famous pithy sentence, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Luther had been given a safe conduct, and unlike Hus, his predecessor, he wasn't seized immediately and killed, but he was in great danger. What preserved him was the political situation in Germany. There were many princes struggling for power against the papacy and against the emperor, and one such prince was Luther's own prince, the Saxon elector Frederick the Wise. He arranged for Luther to be kidnapped by a band of robbers on the way back from Worms and held against his will at the Wartburg castle. This was a technicality for the prince, so that he could say he had no idea where Luther was, when in fact he was keeping him safe in a castle. And it was whilst he was in the Wartburg castle that Luther began translating the New Testament into German and continued his copious writing and commentaries and letters. We have more writings by Luther than I think of almost anyone else of that period. By the time that Luther died, his ideas had spread far and wide over Northern Europe, but they were also being adapted and radicalised in ways that Luther had not intended and he was appalled about. So what were the implications for Luther's Reformation? Well, firstly, the Bible became the foundation of Christian belief and practice. If the Church or the Pope claimed things that could not be justified by the Scripture, then according to Luther and his followers, they erred. They were not correct. The Pope was not infallible. Secondly, faith became democratised. Anyone who was literate could now read the Bible in their own language and indeed preach from it. This meant a far greater diversity of opinion than Luther was prepared for. Thirdly, there is now a far smaller gap between the clergy and the laity. The clergy lost their mystique. They married, they lived like normal people. They were now elected to posts rather than simply appointed. And fourthly, the Church, paradoxically really, I think, grew closer to political power. Rather than simply becoming independent, the Church, particularly in Germany, became very linked to the princes who protected it. It's sometimes called the magisterial Reformation because of the close links between the Church and the secular rulers, magistrates. And this was necessary because Luther and the Reformers needed protection, but it piled up a whole heap of problems for future centuries, particularly by the time we get to 1930s Germany. And in 1525, Luther's democratization of faith resulted in widespread rioting and violence, sometimes called the Peasants' War. in which religious and political revolution combined, with apocalyptic radicals taking over the German town of Munster, creating anarchy, ending with a very, very bloody siege. This was not what Luther foresaw or desired, but to some extent a genie had been let out of the bottle. Luther himself died peacefully in 1546, as much of this was unfolding around him.